welcome back! This week we will be making a pair of 1890s cycling bloomers. As you may know, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll know two things about me. One, cycling is a large part of my daily life, and two, I have a soft spot for free stuff. Sometimes that comes in the form of stuff I rescue from the recycling bin and give a second life as a cool craft. And sometimes that comes in the form of free patterns I find online. Oh, and I guess number 3 is that I have a cute corgi, but she doesn't feature very heavily in this video. She's more of a sidekick, a Pancho Villa to my Don Quixote. Or is that too obscure of a reference? She's the Robin Hood to my Batman. Now I'm mixing my universes. Anyway, moving on. So when I saw this pattern online for free for a pair of late Victorian cycling bloomers, I decided that that was definitely going to be my next project. Because I'm nothing if not a Victorian tomboy.
Also, can we jump on that hashtag, guys? Because I can't be the only one.
And I know for a fact that a pair of pants is simply going to get worn by me more often than a skirt. So many of you may be familiar with this pattern. It's online at bikesandbloomers.com, and I will include a link to it in the description of this video. So there are 6 different patterns in this collection, which comprise a total of 9 different garments, and all of them are inspired by creative cycling wear patents lodged in the 1890s by British women. The pattern only comes in one size, which is approximately UK 12, but it does have 2 versions, one being a tailored version and 2 being a fuller version. And I decided to go with the more tailored version because I thought it would perhaps be more flattering. Unfortunately, there are no instructions provided, and so the order of assembly falls to the individual user. So let's take a look at what this pattern looks like, and then let's make a mock-up. So there definitely seems to be some confusion surrounding the term knickers, knickerbockers, bloomers, drawers, and even +4s. That is a topic for an entirely different video, and one that I do plan in fact to be doing, but for the sake of this video, I will mainly be calling this garment bloomers, simply because that is what the pattern that I got this from calls them.
Okay, got the pattern pieces all cut out, and in super typical me fashion, I must have absconded with this piece. I vaguely remember needing a piece of paper at some point and going, oh, this pattern piece isn't needed, and using it for something else. So yeah, that one has a hole in it. It still holds its shape pretty well. So we have the back, the front, 2 pocket bags here. Not entirely sure why we have 2 bags and why they're completely different shapes, so we're gonna do some reflecting on that and figure out what that's for. Then some facing, we have the front facing, back facing, as well as the cuff that goes at the bottom of the bloomers, belt buckles and tabs, some pieces for the welt pocket. So everything's all cut out. Now I'm just gonna go make a mock-up to see how well it's gonna fit. I suspect that I'm going to have to make it a bit larger. So we're gonna go make a mock-up and then come back and adjust the pattern pieces as necessary. Alright, so I have my first mock-up done, and I think it's going to be my last mock-up because it looks pretty good. The waist fits pretty well. I had to take in 2 little tucks here because it's a tiny bit big, but that's maybe just 1 centimeter each side. No big deal there. I am loving the poof and the way that these are sitting. I did a little bend test just to make sure that nothing is binding or pinching, and that's looking great. This flap here where it's going to button up, that is working out quite well. Overall, I'm super happy with the way that these are fitting. I was expecting to have to make at least a few modifications to this pattern, so it's actually great to see that I really don't have to do much of anything. The last thing I want to test is I'm going to go get the boots that I will be wearing most often with these and just make sure that the length here works with the boots, because I might want to make them a little bit longer. But let's see how they look with the boots. You can see that the cuff wants to pop out a little bit from the boot when I move it around. I think I'm just going to adjust the cuff and make it maybe 3 centimeters longer so it stays tucked within my boot. I think that's going to be the game plan. Just lengthen the cuff a little bit. Make sure that I mark these little tucks here on the pattern. I kind of like the little pleats that it gives. I almost wish they were a little bit bigger, but I'm also really digging the fact that I don't have to make any modifications to the pattern because I don't feel like doing any drafting right now. So we're just going to leave the pattern like it is. Make sure to mark those tucks on the corresponding facing and call it a day. Here are the modifications I've made to the cuff at the bottom of the leg. So first I shortened it because it was too far around for my leg. My calf is not that big. And then after I shortened it, I added on this entire section here, which once it's folded will only extend the cuff by 3 centimeters, but I think that should be enough to do the job. So I just marked out where the pleats were in the front here, putting a little pen mark here at either end, and then when you unpin it, that opens up and it shows you the total width of that pleat. I then transferred this symmetrically over to the other side so that the pleats would be symmetrical because originally one of them was slightly further away from this center seam than the other. Then transferred those markings over to my pattern piece, so here and here, and then those are just going to get folded in like so. So I have the same amount taken out of my pattern as I do of my mock-up. I'm going to tape these down and cut it out of the final fabric.
So for the main fabric, I'll be using this gorgeous hunter green wool, which refuses to show up in a proper color no matter how much I color correct. But because wool can be itchy and I was worried about chafing, I decided to add a lining to the front of these pants out of this fun silk remnant I found. The next step, obviously, was to lay down my pattern piece and cut the various pieces out of my wool. So what I've done now is I've just laid out all of the fabric that is left after having cut out the front pieces and the back pieces. And this is what I have. So I have a pretty large chunk of wool left here and then some kind of odd bits and pieces over here. So what I have left to cut out is 2 of these cuffs, 1 of this long facing here, and 2 of these little facings. Those are the back pieces. The problem is that these are such odd shapes that they're really going to eat into my fabric if I cut them out all as one piece. So I think what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and piece these facings together from this scrap that I have here. And then I just need to cut out 2 of these cuffs, 1 here, and then I'll probably take the second one, just scoot it over and cut it out there. And then I'm going to be left with a much larger, nicer chunk of wool to make something in the future. So it's going to take a bit longer, but I think future me is going to be very happy about this decision when I'm left with a lot more usable wool for a future project. Last night, off camera, I got all those bits and bobs cut out. So we have the 2 cuffs, the buckle pieces, as well as the front and back facing for the pants. I then went ahead and fused some fusible interfacing to the back of all of those, and then I spent about 3 jillion hours making some bias binding out of a contrasting purple quilting fabric. I also spent a long time piecing together those facings. This is the finished facing. This is the front facing, and you can see I've got the bias tape all attached onto it. Also, if you look closely, you can see that the 2 bottom bits here have been pieced on, so that allowed me to save a lot of space on my fabric. And the seam here, it's practically invisible, and then if you look at the back, you can see that the raw edges are just encased under that fusible interfacing. This is the front facing, and it looks really good. Unfortunately, the second facing did not turn out quite as well, and that is because I did it afterwards and I was tired and hungry and made just stupid mistakes. We've all been there. So this one, spot the error. Here the seam is correct, and these 2 seams are clearly facing the wrong direction. Normally I would just unpick the one that's in the wrong direction and sew it back on in the right direction, except that past me decided I just wanted to get it done and blew through that stage and went ahead and fused it like this. And I vaguely remember that decision and going, it. And now present me has to deal with the fallout from that decision. So I just went ahead and cut out some extra strips of bias tape, and I'm just going to lay those on top of the seams and sew them down to the right side so those contrasting bits will be showing. We'll just call it a design element, and that's how we're going to deal with that situation. Past me can be a bit of a dick. That's the plan of attack for today. I'm going to finish up those facings, get all of the bias tape sewn down, both around the borders and then to cover up the mistakes from last night. And then I'm going to look at the welt pockets, try to get the whole pocket situation sorted out. Let's get to it.
Considering it was a complete mistake, it actually turned out looking okay. At least these seams are fairly symmetrical, so it almost looks like I meant to do it on purpose. Hey guys, editing Shannon here to let you know that this video is already incredibly long without the massive detour that this Welt Pocket adventure took. So please enjoy this abridged version of the Pocket Saga, and know that I will have an entire video coming out next week about how I tackled these pockets. So hang tight for that, and in the meantime...
And now back to your regularly scheduled program.
So it could be a lot worse, but it could also have been a lot better. In trying to cobble together a couple different tutorials, I sort of ended up following half of a single welt tutorial and half of a double welt tutorial, and that caused a bit of confusion here. As you can see, everything is very cleanly stitched and lines up, but my welt is half the distance that it needs to be. Oops. So we're just going to go and pick this line of stitching out here and shift this whole welt up that way. You can see on the back here I have plenty of room to do that, so I just need to shift this whole piece up that way. Should I have done a mock-up? Maybe. Is it going to be a disaster? No. Let's go take care of that. And we're back, and we have remedied the situation, pretty much, 90% there. So I elongated this well. You can still see through it. There is a little gap here. It is not 100% perfect, but once we get some fashion fabric behind it, like so, it will be nearly invisible. Let's go do the second pocket, and let's do it with new and improved technique.
So now that the pockets were done, I could move on with sewing these pants together. First, I sewed up the crotch seams, and then added the facings. That awkward moment when your facing doesn't fit and you realize you've forgotten the darts in the front. So I had to go back and quickly add those darts in before I could continue with attaching the facings. Next, I basted the facings in with a large running stitch, just to make sure that those darts and seam allowances would all be sewn down in the correct direction, and then I sewed over the same path with my machine. Next, I turned the facings right side out, making sure to push the corners through so they were as sharp as possible. I then pressed the entire top of the pants, making sure that those top edges were nice and lined up. This will make the top stitching much easier. So I have just finished top stitching down this whole line of the pants here, sewing as close to the edge as possible, and now that top line is really nice and sharp. This is what the inside looks like. So now all the facings are all finished and attached, and I finally get to sew the legs together.
So I now have to go through and hide all of the raw edges from the silk layer because those unravel like this. So what I'm doing is I'm first going through and trimming all of the silk edges so that they're about half the width of the woolen seam allowance, and then hiding that raw edge by tucking it under the seam allowance of the woolen layer and doing a herringbone stitch to tack it down. So you can see that the top part of the herringbone stitch is passing through both the woolen seam allowance and the silk lining, whereas the bottom row of the stitch is passing only through the silk layer. And if we look on the inside, we can see that both lines of stitches are passing through the silk layer, but that neither of them are catching the woolen exterior fabric. So none of these stitches are visible from the outside, and this stitch is actually doing double duty because it's hiding the raw edges of the silk lining, but it's also helping to prevent this woolen edge from being bumped or jostled and possibly fraying over time. So that's how I've chosen to finish off the interior. Now, the alternative here, if you have a serger and you don't like hand stitching, would obviously be just to serge all of your silk layers before you start any of this process, but I don't have access to a serger and I quite like hand sewing, so this is the way I'm going to go, but definitely know that there are other ways to do this.
So now that the facings are all finished and attached and my raw edges are all taken care of, I can finally move on to sewing the legs together.
Okay guys, I wanted to give you a quick update on how exactly I'm going to pin and sew the outside seams, because with this placket here it can be a little bit tricky. I'm calling it a placket. I'm not actually sure if that's the correct terminology. So what I've done is I've made sure to line up this top point here so that when this folds over, this is going to be the point of contact. So it's most important that this lines up, and then following it down here to where these 2 points meet, I've marked that with a pin, and then I just pinned all the way down the rest of the leg. Hopefully this should match up for you at the end there, and then you're just going to sew down, making sure not to sew this part closed because that will get buttons and buttonholes in the next step.
To attach the cuff, I first ran a gathering stitch along the bottom edge of the pant legs, making sure to keep my gathers more or less evenly spaced, and to make sure to snag the silk layer as well as the outer woolen layer in my gathering stitches. I then attached the cuff to the pant legs, making sure to line up the seam of the cuff with the inseam of the pants to keep it as invisible as possible. I then made sure that my gathers were evenly spaced. I then employed all of the pins in my possession in order to hold those gathers in place as I sewed them down. A quick press ensured that the outside of that seam stayed flat for the next step, which was to then turn the cuff under, hiding the raw edges both of the cuff and the pant leg. This was once again pinned down, then turned right side out for some top stitching.
So on the outside it looks like this, and then the inside looks like this.
Finally, it was time for finishing touches. I decided I wanted my buttons to stand out, so I covered them with some scraps of the lining fabric. First, I had to find out which size circle was best for covering my buttons. Then I'd outline that circle on the silk, cut it out with a bit of extra room, and hand saw the raw edges under. Then I used those same stitches as a gathering thread to gather the fabric around my button, pulling it tight and carefully tying it off.
To mark the button placement, rather than blindly following the marks on the pattern, I marked the first button, sewed that on, then pinned the pants on me so they were comfortable, smoothing down the button placket completely before marking the position for the second button. I repeated this process for all of the buttons, which was supposed to guarantee ideal button placement. So it only took me 4 buttons and 1 cup of coffee to realize why this button looks different from all the others, and that is because I was marking my mark by measuring the wrong side of the buttonhole. So don't be like me, kids. Drink your coffee before you sew.
run.
They're cycling pants, not running pants. Alright guys, I have to deem this project a great success. These pants are so comfortable. Not only do they add a nice little bit of historical flair to your everyday wardrobe, they aren't incredibly conspicuous. So if you're feeling a little bit self-conscious about history bounding, or if you're looking for an alternative to a skirt, I highly recommend these pants as a place to start. I would have loved to style these for you in a few different ways to show you how versatile they are, but unfortunately I have a very small wardrobe, and trust me, I am working on expanding it, but for the moment you will have to use your imagination. The pros: they are super comfortable, the pockets are huge and can easily fit my cell phone, the cut is baggy enough that you can't tell that I have a ton of things in my pocket, they're really cute, and the lining gives me a nice little swish, swish, swish as I walk down the street, so I feel like a pirate. Also, I find that the fit is very flattering. The cons: these come with no assembly instructions, so if you are new to sewing, this could be a little bit tricky. The construction of the pocket is definitely not very clear. Those Welt Pockets were... I have an entirely separate video that will be coming out on this issue because they were a little bit confusing. I have a list of modifications, all very small ones, that I would make for my second pair, which is definitely going to be happening, and I think I might actually try a more historically accurate second pattern. Also, the length could use a little bit of adjustment. They are a tiny bit too short for me, and I have quite short legs. In the future, I would definitely consider adding about 5 centimeters to the pant leg itself. Also, even though I added some extra length to this cuff here, it still is a little bit too short. That's about it on the cons. So in researching this pattern and this video, I fell down a pretty intense rabbit hole of investigating 1890s cycling attire and fashion, and I found it absolutely fascinating. So I definitely foresee more videos in the future regarding this topic, perhaps an entire ensemble, as well as some information on the history of this cycling craze that absolutely hit during the mid-1890s. As I mentioned, I will have an entirely separate video on the Welt Pockets and how I went about making them, as well as some of my other sewing tips and tricks that I use specifically on this project to make the process go a little bit smoother and the result come out a little bit cleaner. So if you're interested in that and you are looking for some more history bounding content, as well as historically focused information and a healthy dose of corgis and crafting, please consider clicking subscribe and hitting that notification bell down below so that you'll be notified every time I have a new video. Should theoretically be every Saturday. And until next week, have fun, stay safe, and get sewing. Bye! English today.
Get out. Without your rubber band, which is not very accurate.
Did you ring the bell? I don't even know. I don't use YouTube enough. Have I always been this bad at winking? Actually, I didn't do too bad of a job.